Marley Shebala. You're in Window Rock, and tell us where you are there because you're in a little bit of a different environment than we're used to at your office at the Navajo Times, but you've been covering the new Navajo Nation legislature, which is now 24 rather than 88. Tell us a little bit about that and some of the other things the Navajo Times are covering this week.
Okay, Yata to everyone, and I'm here at the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock. But since January 11th, which is when the 24 delegates were inaugurated, I've been covering their attempts to restructure the government to reflect 24 members instead of 88. Under Navajo law, they have to have a quorum of 45 for the council to meet, which of course then prohibits the 24 from meeting. So they have to change those laws. So a day after inauguration on January 12th, they immediately went into a 9-day work session to begin restructuring the tribal government. And they did. They worked, and they even looked at combining Navajo concepts of government with the westernized government laws that they have right now, because of course most of the tribal governments had their governments replaced with the federal government's style of governance. So they went into that session and they did their amendments, and it looks great. They reduced their standing committees from 12 to actually 4, with the 5th committee having representation of all of the committees. And it would basically be an area 2 that would reflect the Navajo peacemaking type of arriving at consensus, which was it was beautiful in theory. And so they were ready on Friday to look at their proposed legislation with all their amendments in there, which also included, which was really great as far as transparency, because they've been kicking that word around. That's the new word now for the 24s, transparency in government. And in there, they said that any proposed legislation would be sent out immediately by internet out to the chapters, to the division directors, and it should be posted on their website, which has always been a big issue for me. I've covered Navajo government for 25 years, and you either have to find a very different way of getting the legislation, or they will actually give it to you, or there are times when some delegates feeling that they could not just hand me the legislation would actually throw it in the trash can. I'd go over there and pick it out. But now it's going to be on the internet. So all of these amendments were reflective of that type of let's get in consensus, let's do this for the people. And then on Friday, they walk in and one of the delegates says, "Hey, I missed the deadline to be a candidate for the speaker, and nobody told me about it, and who are the candidates?" Because we found out who the candidates were. They sent us a press release. And so it was I was wondering, why are they bringing this up now at the 11th hour after the deadline has come and gone? And after pushing that story, come to find out that the Arizona delegates had started lobbying to elect a speaker who was from Arizona. It bothered me, and it bothered people that found out about it, that they felt that, if they're going to have a speaker, that speaker should be qualified. And the current process that was replaced, the speaker candidates had to meet a deadline, they had to have a written resume, they also had to have a written platform, which reflected their ability to manage the legislative branch. And but that was all cleared away off the table, and they spent all day Friday going through a new process, and in the end, they didn't have a chance to really look at their new legislation with all of their amendments.
Right. Just based on the speaker's election, was I reading in the latest issue of the Navajo Times that it was like a 9-hour process to get a speaker elected?
Yeah, and after they used one of their days to amend the speaker selection process, and I asked several of them, was this one of the laws that had to be changed for you to be able to come in and function as a government? And all the delegates that I questioned, including the speaker now, said no. They didn't need to change that. They could have waited in 2 years when they were going to elect their new speaker, or even 1 year down the road, but they were so adamant about, that they wanted a delegate from Arizona to be their speaker. And so they wasted that Friday, and then the first day of the council session, they spent the whole day trying to get this legislation on. They actually called a special session, and then they didn't get anywhere with the special sessions. So by law, they had to go into the regular session. And in the end, on day 5, about 9 o'clock, they voted down their legislation for the amendments to reflect 24, simply because it wasn't what they had proposed, what they had worked on for 8 days. But by then it was too late, and with midnight coming on day 5, under Navajo law, the council can only meet for 5 days. They can't extend it for any reason. And under Navajo law, the only major overhauls to the Navajo government can be done in regular session. And regular sessions are only scheduled for 4 times a year. Right. And so that was it. So they had to quickly bring in another legislation, which they're working under now, which is that they are now a committee. All of them are members on this committee, and then that committee has taken all the powers of the existing 12 standing committees. Under their new amendments, they would have reduced the 12 standing committees to 24 to 4 plus the 5, which represents everyone.
Right. Now, it's the prerogative generally of the senators or congressmen up in Washington, D.C. They decided to read the entire Constitution out loud not too long ago, and obviously within the Navajo Nation, you have a new legislature whose prerogatives for priorities exist, but does it seem to be getting off to a little bit of a rough start in terms of legislating? Is that what you're observing?
Yes, when they came in on January 12th, the day after being inaugurated, they came in really believing that they were going to be able to talk everything out, come to a consensus on everything, and move forward. And they were moving forward. It was wonderful to watch a tribal legislative group actually talking about transparency in government, talking about doing everything in the best interest of the people. In fact, one of the amendments says that they are going to post all of their legislation on the internet, like I said. And that seems to be a key word with 24 is transparency in government. Yeah. And then it fell apart when they decided, that they wanted someone to be the speaker no matter what. And they keep shooting themselves in the foot, so to speak, by doing these things and not realizing it, or I'm not sure if they're realizing it. But it's
the world is looking in, not only the Navajo Nation members and citizens, but the world is looking in a lot of ways. They expect them to get some business done in a consensus making or majority rules, whatever it is.
Well, that was the whole discussion among the people, was that, with reducing the council from 88 to 24, that they would all be there in the council session, that they would be moving along, there wouldn't be taking up a lot of time, and it would be a huge cost savings, and the voters, would actually see their government doing something. But it hasn't happened, and in fact, I'm going to be doing a story next week on how they're really having problems maintaining a quorum. Last night they met until 10 o'clock, and they were going to start looking at a huge lease renewal for the Four Corners power plant. And that's been in the news nationally with the pollution and nitrogen oxide. And instead they lost the quorum just as they were taking it up. But they needed 13. They needed 13 delegates, and they didn't have 13 delegates on the floor.
They voted for a continuing resolution to keep the government operating in schools and those kinds of things?
Well, they did. They already approved that under the prior council. And the prior council did that because they realized that if they approved a budget, that budget would reflect 88 delegates and not 24 delegates. So out of respect for the incoming delegates, they said, let's put the tribal government on a continuing resolution. But that continuing resolution also expires on March 31st. and they don't go into regular session for their spring session until April. And so now you're going to have the budget ending, and they're not going to be able to come back in and approve it. And they are, it's like they're having this rude awakening each step of the way. And there's, you know, the Navajo Times reporting, hey, you guys, you know, we're sticking by you. We're staying here no matter how late you go, simply because the people really want to know what their new government is doing. Everything that they had hoped for. Is it happening? No.
And you said,
sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
yeah, and you said transparency, and I saw the editor, DeWayne Bayel's commentary in regards to freedom of information and transparency and the way it ought to be conducted for all citizens of the Navajo Nation to be able to see what their elected elected members are doing. Tell me something else here that's going on here. We've got some talk about, and segue at it. We'll get back and talk more about government as it goes on, but you wanted to tell me a little bit about the Navajo basketball team, which I took a little bit of interest in. They're all speakers of the language?
Yeah, and they come from this little community called Pueblo Pintado, and that is in the farther northern, they said would be the northeastern part of the Navajo Reservation. And they're at the bottom of the, they haven't won a lot of games. So they're not up there in the top 5 or even top 10. But their coach says that what's unique about his team is that they all speak Navajo. And because they all speak Navajo, they encourage each other in Navajo. After a game, before a game, during the game, they're chatting in Navajo. And that, I think, is an excellent story that was done by our sports editor, Candice Bigodi. And she speaks Navajo very well. So she was able to write portions of the story in Navajo, and people should be able to go onto the Navajo Times website and read that story and see the photographs of this team. And you know, in this day and age when, you know, you have linguists saying, you know, the languages are being lost and a lot of the tribes are really pushing for their young people to learn the language. That's what I mean. This story is wonderful. It puts a lot of hope in people.
I remember as a member of the Native American Journalists Association Board of Directors hearing an award-winning Navajo-speaking football MC or narrator, someone watching in, and he'd be going along speaking Navajo, and all of a sudden, touchdown would come out, and I'd be able to understand that much. Do they still do games in the language down there?
Yes, that's why KTNN radio station received the last 50,000 watt license from the Federal Communications Commission, was simply because they recognized that a huge portion of the Navajo population still spoke the language. And I was the first news director. And that's the thing about language. It has so much more power than the English language. And it goes back to what I was taught, which is that, and I think this goes for all of our languages, indigenous people, is that it's the language of the holy people, and we were blessed with it, you know, to pray, to conduct ourselves, and therefore it's very powerful. And so when the news was presented in English and in Navajo, it was a real threat to then Chairman Peter McDonald, because the people who voted him in and were watching him were the Navajo speakers. That's where they were the ones that went to the polls. And to show that, you know, I was kicked out. But he was my most avid listener. I mean, every day, right after I finished a morning news, I would get a phone. The phone would ring, and I'd pick it up, and it'd be the chairman's office complaining that, you know, I'm just supposed to read their press releases. But of course, they would never put that in writing. And I say, well, you know, put it in writing. You know, we'll talk about it. But they knew they couldn't because we were under an FCC license.
Always a joy talking to you. We got to go for the day. We'll get back to you. That's an interesting story. Like hearing it. We'll go to www.navajotimes.com.
Yeah.
Get more information there. Thanks, Marley.
Sure. I'll go, Nat.